This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Fine. With me is high school teacher Stacy Skinner. Stacy teaches United States Government at William R. Boone High School in Orlando, and she's a teaching associate at the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship.
Working with the Florida Joint Center has given me the opportunity to become a Civics mentor teacher for the Civics Mentor Teacher program. And that has created a further interest in combining American history and government. So I have some questions for you today about the Articles of Confederation, kind of an often overlooked part of our government. And I'd like to start with why the founders created a government that, in hindsight, turned out to be so weak.
You know, it's interesting that the Articles of Confederation were actually the first American government. Many people believe that because we live under the United States Constitution in the United States, of course, we live under this document, live under this government, we just assume it's been around for hundreds of years.
I have students that think that the Constitution was part of the peace treaty that ended the revolution.
Right. I mean, people really believe that the first government is the U.S. Constitution, that somehow they got it right on the first try.
Yes.
Well, they didn't get it right on the first try. Actually, the first try was the opposite of the government under which the colonists were living before they declared independence. When we look at different forms of government, we often have to ask ourselves, where is the power focused? In a unitary system where the power is in one place, the Latin root for one is uni, U-N-I, so unitary system means that the power is in one place. The legislative, executive, judiciary power, all in the same place. And for the colonists' experience, that was with a king or under a monarchy. So when they declared independence, they treated it like any other divorce, right? Under a divorce situation, oftentimes people will do the opposite of their experience. And so in this case, if there was a centralized unitary government, and they had
decentralized.
They went to decentralized government. They went in the opposite direction. If the power was in one place, they decided the power should be in lots of places.
And so that's how we end up with a confederation.
Right.
So explain to me what a confederation is and how this Articles of Confederation, what is that meant to accomplish?
Well, it's an interesting question because there were 13 colonies that became 13 states, and the Articles of Confederation gave the power to the 13 states and gave it to them equally. So what that meant was that each state could decide its own tax code, each state could decide whether or not it wanted to trade with any other country, each state could decide how it treated people who came into their state, each state could even decide about money and its value.
So they're essentially operating as 13 different nations.
Absolutely, they were operating as 13 different nations. And yet the problem was that when one part of this nation, so to speak, made up of 13 nations, was attacked, then the other 12 really were vulnerable. For example, Boston has a harbor. Well, if Boston Harbor were attacked, then the enemy would have more access to people living in other parts of this nation, of this decentralized nation. Every state could have its own military if they wanted. Every state could decide if they wanted to give money to a very weak national government.
So there's no uniform system to run things.
Not only was there no uniform system, but in many respects, because every state had equal rights, which is what they wanted in theory, and they found out in practice equal rights really didn't work too well. What that meant was if there was a national decision to be made, that every single state got one vote, which means that just like with a jury, when a jury has to have every single juror agreeing, if there's one juror that disagrees, is there a decision made? Can you go to the judge and say, we voted, Your Honor, 10-2? Absolutely not.
It has to be unanimous.
It has to be unanimous. And so what that meant was a tiny little state like Rhode Island had equal power to the big bad state of Virginia. And so consequently, it meant that it was very, very difficult for the nation to function as a nation for that very reason.
Talk to me about, if you will, two aspects of the phrasing. We often refer to them as the Articles of Confederation, but the proper title is Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. We know that perpetual union was not the case in the end, but why was that part of the titling? And also, within the verbiage of the Articles is this notion of League of Friendship. Where did that originate from? Because that's not it doesn't seem like very official phrasing for a formal document.
Because if we go even back to the Declaration of Independence, people focus so much attention on the preamble. They often forget that the Declaration of Independence had a beginning and it had an end. And the end talks about this idea about people having a sacred connection to one another. And so we can often understand these phrases that you're talking about if we look at the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence in terms of people not only making a commitment to one another for the survival, for the perpetual survival of this nation, but also placing their confidence in this God, in this higher power that would see to their safety and prudence into the future.
So analyze the Articles as you would any other primary source document, looking at its structure.
You have to look at its structure, look at its substance, and we see here that they truly believed that if things were going so badly under King George III, that things then would go well if they did the opposite of that.
Right, and a lot of people say too, and in many textbooks even, the Articles are glossed over because they structured a weak government. But isn't it that the Articles were structured that way very purposely to protect against the grievances of the Declaration occurring again? And if you look at the grievances in coordination with the Articles, you see that design.
Right, that you can do an absolute correspondence if you look at the grievances in the Articles and you look at the things that King George did badly. And you hear how I'm saying that, don't you?
Because all the grievances begin with he.
Right.
It's the world's greatest breakup letter.
Right. It's the world's greatest breakup letter. Everything's in the third person. It's a list of complaints against King George III. It's not written to him. It's written about him. And so they wanted to say, okay, he's done all these horrible things. We're not going to do those things either. So in the preamble, going back to that, it says, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Okay? So they not only said that the history of the government was a problem, but the person. And they also said in that same paragraph that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the goals of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it.
And institute a new government.
And institute new government. So what does that mean? The person was a problem, the government was a problem, that whenever any form of government and the history of the present king. Therefore, they had to get rid of King George III. He wasn't going to play with them anymore. And they had to form a government that would allow for people to enjoy their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
And since the Declaration does not establish a government, then we have the creation of the Articles.
Right, and what better way to establish life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness than to have less imposition of government on the people rather than more.
And that less imposition of the government that's established by the Articles, what weaknesses does that create in the Articles?
Well, think about it. If you have a national government, very weak national government, that can only function through voluntary contributions in terms of military personnel, in terms of people voluntarily paying a tax, what's going to happen is not only are some states going to contribute more than others, but some states might not contribute anything at all. And yet, guess what? If they are attacked, then that means that those attackers then have access to these other states that may have been paying in. So it also breeds a lot of resentment among the different states.
Now, how are these weaknesses of the Articles, which did not lead to a perpetual union, how are these key weaknesses reflected in our Constitution that governs our nation today?
Well, interestingly enough, at the Constitutional Convention, the person who we often call the father of the Constitution, James Madison, he was later Secretary of State, and then he was president after that. James Madison argued that there were certain functions of government that had to be the same for every state. And he argued for a shared system of governing, that the national government would be created to have certain powers would remain with the states, and that other powers would be shared. So for example, Stacy, we've been talking about military today, and we've been talking about taxes. When it comes to taxes, in order for governments to function, they need money, and so the state governments can tax, and the federal government can tax. But when it comes to defending the nation, there needs to be one military. And therefore, our military is a nationalized military. Even when people serve their country in the National Guard, there is a state associated with that National Guard, but it still has the phrase national in it. So there's an Illinois National Guard, there's an Alabama National Guard, etc. There has to be this connection and a commitment to mutual survival.
And can you explain to me, when the Articles were short in duration, how it is that our Constitution lasted so long, but the Articles did not?
Well, it's interesting because there were some of our founding fathers, such as Alexander Hamilton, who understood that the Articles absolutely could not be fixed. They could not function as they were. So when the founding fathers met in the summer, in May of 1787, to fix the Articles, actually James Madison convinced George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, instead of trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed, they instead were going to simply form a government that would respect states' rights, while at the same time addressing the most difficult of the conflicts between and among the states, such as military issues, such as currency issues and trade issues. And so, as you were mentioning before, how you can go to the Articles of Confederation and see the issues from the Declaration listed, you can also go to Article 1, Section 8 and see the same thing. And what we find is what the Founding Fathers did, because remember, everybody who went to that Constitutional Convention was interested in fixing the Articles. So those folks still had to be convinced that giving power to a national government was not going to be going back to a monarchy. So what we see when we read the Constitution is we see that the states' rights are emphasized in every single article. The states, for example, choose their representatives to Congress. The states choose their electors to elect the president. The states, through the Congress, form courts. The states, through the U.S. Senate, confirm members of the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's all kinds of ways that states' rights are reflected in the new document. Okay, we're going to have to recap at this time, and briefly, we talked about the Articles of Confederation, its weaknesses, and how the Articles led to the writing of the U.S. Constitution. And that's Conversation in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine.